They are caring more about punching holes in the darkness than they are them. My life is His. I have committed my life to Him to use me any way He pleases in order to make His name great. That's suffering for Jesus. And He's saying that is what is the norm in this kingdom of what is it that makes you cry or happy or sad or miserable? What is it that every single one of these men were discouraged in their life, but they did something that I want us. Okay, welcome to those of you that are watching us online, Roku, any one of our apps, however you found us. We are glad you're joining us today. Today, we have a guest speaker, Miss Kristen Jane Anderson. And if you, first of all, want to know more about our ministry, you can go online to womensbiblestudy.com. That's where you can actually see. It's going to be a 2-part series today. And if you're watching part 1, we're hoping part 2 will be up the same day. We'll see how that goes. So we'll have both parts up on all the different places, the apps and everything on Friday. So we're glad you're joining us today, because if you are, that means it's up. So yay, we're super glad about that. If you want to see Kristen's book, I forgot to bring one up here. It's a book, actually, it's called Life in Spite of Me. You can buy them at Amazon or Barnes & Noble's on their website, I think. So once we get done here, yes, this is what it looks like. Life in Spite of Me by Kristen Jane Anderson. So if you want to do that, you're not here to buy it, so you have to buy it on your own. So, okay, yesterday she got to speak at Phoenix Christian and Arizona Christian University. These kids were absolutely mesmerized, standing ovation at both schools. And for high schoolers, that's a big deal, okay? So I am so excited to have you here. So take it away, Miss Kristen.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor just to come and share my story with you and have you listen. I'm going to start out talking from the beginning just because it's easiest to start there, because I had a really normal childhood. I had 2 parents who were always married. I didn't have any trials or tragedies in my life as a kid. I had an older brother, an older sister. They usually treated me pretty good. Life was just really easy as a child. But when I got around the ages of 12, 13 years old, I started to realize the world wasn't as great as I thought it was, and people weren't as genuine as I thought they were. I also became aware that there were wars going on in the world, that sexual abuse was a real issue, and how bad of a problem homelessness was in the area that I lived. And I became burdened by all of those things. I wanted to do something to make a difference in the world. So I started volunteering at our local homeless shelter for about a year every Friday night. And at the end of that year, I looked around and it seemed like homelessness was just as much of an issue as when I started, so I stopped helping other people. And as I went into high school, I just started to focus on trying to make myself, my family, and my friends happy. And in the beginning of high school, that seemed to work for a little while. I was doing pretty well. I had a lot of friends. I was on the soccer team. My boyfriend was prom king. I just thought life was good again, but then very quickly and very unexpectedly, a number of things started to go wrong. Among those things, I lost 4 of my friends. I lost one in a car accident. I lost one in a motorcycle accident. I lost one because of a brain tumor, and I lost one because of suicide. And at the ages of 16, 17 years old, I had no idea how to handle any of it. On top of my friends who died, I lost my grandmother. I was raped, and I was being stalked by 2 young men. And I didn't know that I could go to God for comfort, wisdom, strength, understanding. I thought I just had to handle it all on my own. And I was sort of the friend that everybody went to for help with their problems. So I kept all my problems inside and just pushed them down. And very quickly, I started spiraling down into a very deep and a very scary depression. And I didn't really know how bad I was doing, but I was physically getting sick every day. I was starting to skip school. I was starting to skip classes if I was at school. I was starting to smoke and drink and really just numb the pain that I felt on the inside. My parents knew that something was wrong with me, but they had no idea how bad I was doing. They didn't know how bad my friends' deaths had affected me, and they didn't know that I'd been raped. So when they took me to see counselors and doctors, they assumed that I was just dealing with stress and anxiety. Nobody ever used the word depression. And I continued spiraling down into this deep and scary place. I remember I would say things like, life sucks all of the time, because I meant it so seriously, but I will never say that now because I meant it so seriously then. And eventually, New Year's Eve of my senior year came, and I was supposed to be grounded because I'd been skipping school and my grades were dropping. But they were going to let me go out this one time, New Year's Eve of my senior year. They were going to just be nice, extra nice to me. And I remember going back and forth with my parents about what time I would come home that night. They wanted me to come home just after midnight, but I wanted to stay home, out with my friends. I wanted to sleep over at a friend's house, and they just weren't okay with that. They were always very loving, very protective, so they wanted me to come home that night. And I remember after arguing with them about it for a while, I agreed to come home when they wanted me to, but I left the house knowing in my mind that I wasn't going to come home at all that night. And I went to work at the pizza restaurant I'd been working at. My friend picked me up, and we went to a party, and I felt like I made a lot of good decisions that night. That night I didn't drink. I was the designated driver for my friends who were drinking. I didn't do anything wrong with boys. I just made a lot of good decisions that night. But I called my mom at about midnight to tell her I wasn't coming home, and I hung up the phone on her before she could even respond. And the next morning I came home at about 10 a.m., and my parents were just beside themselves. They were up all night worrying about me. They didn't know where I was. They didn't know where to find me. They didn't know if I was okay. I remember one of the things my mother said was, "We didn't know if you were dead in a ditch somewhere or what happened to you." And I felt terrible, but they didn't know everything that was going on in my life. They thought I was just being really rebellious. So they made my punishment material and social. They told me I was going to be grounded until further notice, and they were going to return the things that I'd gotten for Christmas and either give them to somebody who would appreciate them or return them to the store. And at that time in my life, it was sort of devastating. It was quite devastating because I was very materialistic. I found a lot of my value in the way that I looked and the clothes that I had, and my friends were sort of my world. So to be grounded until further notice and not know when I could see them again was very hard for me. I was sort of living for my friends at the time. But that day, I was tired. I had been up the whole night before, so I slept all the way through the day, through the night, and when I woke up, it was Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, we always went to church. It's something we did my whole life. Every single Sunday we were at church. I went to Sunday school. I was involved with the youth group, but I went to church and I left feeling exactly the same way, just really broken, lost, disillusioned, confused. I didn't really know what to do with the way that I was feeling. I kept hoping that things would get better. I kept believing that things would get better, but it felt like things were just getting worse and worse. And when we went home from church, my dad went to buy a new washer and dryer. My mom laid down on the couch because she was tired from waiting up for me that other night. And I decided to put some videos on of my nephews watching or opening their Christmas presents that year. It was just a few weeks beforehand, and they were really little at the time, and I thought it might put a smile on my face. So I watched the videos, and it did cheer me up a little bit. But then my best friend called. My best friend's name was Kelly, and we'd been friends since we were in second grade, and she wanted me to come over to her house to make gingerbread houses. This was our last day of Christmas break before we were supposed to go back to school, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be going anywhere, but Kelly and I didn't always make the best decisions together, and I decided that I couldn't get in any worse trouble if I left. So I very dishonestly wrote a note to my parents saying I was going for a walk, and my friend picked me up down the street. We went to her house. I was gone for about 5 hours, and another friend dropped me off down the street at the end of those 5 hours, and I started to walk home just feeling like I couldn't handle it. I wasn't ready to deal with my parents, and more importantly, I wasn't ready to deal with my life. So I walked to the pizza restaurant I'd been working at. I got my paycheck, I got a pack of cigarettes, and I just tried to waste time as best as I could, try to de-stress. But after about a half an hour, I knew I had to go home. I knew my parents would be very worried about me, and I couldn't really push it any farther. So I started to walk home, and again, I just didn't feel like I could do it. I didn't feel like I had anything left in me. So I started walking to the park that I grew up playing in. It was just across the street from my parents' house. And I started swinging on the swings while I was there. In swinging on the swings, I started to remember all these happy childhood memories that I had playing in this park growing up. I was always swinging on the swings, going down the slides, swimming at the beach, playing on the equipment by the beach. And I just remembered all these happy childhood memories I had. And then I was contrasting all those memories with how I was feeling now as a teenager. And I didn't understand how to go back, how to move forward. I felt like no matter what I did, I was just going in circles. Things were not getting better. If anything, they were getting worse. And I didn't know else to do anymore. And then I remembered, as I'm thinking through this, in this small town that I grew up in, you're not supposed to be in the park after dark. I grew up about an hour north of Chicago, and just for safety's sake, they patrol the park to make sure nobody's in there, and if they see somebody, they make them go home. But I wasn't ready to go home yet. I didn't want to go home yet, so I looked around to see where else I could go. And on the edge of the park, there was a train that was parked. I figured it'd been parked there for about 3 weeks because I'd driven by and it hadn't moved at all. So I figured it wasn't going anywhere. So I decided to go over there, and I figured it would give me a little bit more time to think. And I sat on the train once I got there. And sitting on the train triggered a thought process that I'd had about 3 months beforehand. And that was as I was grieving through my friend Brandon's death. My friend Brandon's death was the hardest for me because I just didn't understand how he could ever take his life, why he would ever commit suicide, and how he could ever do it the way that he did it. I just didn't understand it at all. I remember thinking I could never do that. I could never commit suicide, especially the way that he did it. But then my thought process started to change, and I thought, I could never do it, but if I did it, how would I do it if I'd never do it the way that he did it? And a number of things started to go through my mind, things I'd heard about, read about, or seen on TV, and none of them seemed like they would necessarily work or be good enough until a train went by my parents' house. And I could feel the power of the train shake our home. I could hear the whistle blare through the windows, and it just snapped in my mind. That's one way I could never live through it. And I never thought about it again until 3 months later when I was sitting on the train that day. And that's when suicide entered my mind as an option or as an answer. I knew that it wasn't the answer. I knew that it wasn't what I was supposed to do, but I didn't know what the answer was. I wasn't sure where else to turn. I wasn't sure how much longer I could wait for things to get better. So I was really back and forth in my mind. I would think things like, there's a reason I'm here, and then I would think there's no reason I'm here. I would think there's something I'm supposed to do here, and then I would think there's nothing I'm supposed to do here. I would think it's going to get better, and then I would think it's not going to get any better. And I was back and forth like that for probably about an hour and a half. And I didn't understand it as this at the time, but I think there was a spiritual battle going on in my head between good and evil, between God and Satan. Instead, I just thought I was really confused, really messed up in my thinking, and couldn't make a decision. But as I was back and forth in my mind for about an hour and a half, all of a sudden, a train started to come. And I hadn't made a decision. I didn't know what I was going to do. But it was freezing cold out. It was January 2nd, the middle of winter. It was about 8:30 at night. I had a winter coat on, gloves. You could see my breath. My hands were getting cold. I knew I needed to make some sort of a decision or go somewhere. So very, very impulsively, right before the train got to me, I made the decision to lay down on the tracks. And I remember as I got off the train I was sitting on, just trying to push down the fear and the shame that I felt on the inside, because I knew this wasn't what I was supposed to be doing. But as I laid down on the tracks, I closed my eyes, I clenched my fists, and I turned my head in the opposite direction from where the train was coming, because I didn't want to see it come at me. And I laid there and basically just tried to brace myself for what was about to come. I had no idea what to expect. But it was only about a split second before the train started to go over me. And what I felt when the train started to go over me is I felt it begin to suck me upward. I felt my hair rise first, then my shoulders, then the midsection of my body. And very quickly afterward, I felt something push me down and hold me down into the ground, almost like there was a hand on my back. And I didn't know what that was at the time. I just remember feeling that and hearing the roar of the train above me and feeling the breeze, pass above me too. But I really believe that was God mercifully just sparing my life and protecting me. I remember feeling that until the train came to a stop. And when the train came to a stop, I was really just confused. I didn't know if I was alive or dead. I didn't know if this was a bad dream. I didn't know if it was a nightmare. I just wasn't sure what to think at the time. So I opened my eyes, I unclenched my fists, I started to look around to see what had just happened. And as I looked around, I looked behind me, and about 10 feet behind me on my right, I saw my legs. And I knew that they were my legs because they had these bright white tennis shoes on them that I had just gotten for Christmas. but it just felt like this could not be real. This could not be my reality. This could not be happening. This had to be a bad dream. I didn't feel like this could be real. This had to be a terrible, terrible dream. So I gathered myself emotionally as best as I could. I crawled out from underneath the train with my arms. I started to look down at my legs, and when I looked to my left leg, it was so dark out, and my left leg had been severed so high, I couldn't see anything there. So I turned my attention to my right leg, and it looked like it had been severed below the knee, but I'd never seen my leg like that before. I'd never even seen an amputated leg before. So I took my hand and I ran it below where it looked like it had been severed. I thought if I could do that, I would know that it was gone. And when I did that, I unintentionally brought my hand up to my face. And when I brought my hand up to my face, I saw all of the blood, and that's when the pain hit me, because when the train was going over me, I felt pain, but it was sort of dull in the background sort of pain. That's the best way I know how to describe it. And when I saw all the blood, it became real, and it was much more loud in your face sort of pain. I started crying harder than I'd ever cried in my life. I was absolutely in the worst pain I had ever been in my life. I was crying for my mom the way that a small child would. And my mom doesn't like that part of the story so much because she was out looking for me. And she always just wonders if she didn't hear me. But even if she could have heard me, there's nothing she could have done to help me in that moment. There's nothing she could have done to help me at all in that moment. Only God could come near and help me in that moment, and he absolutely did. As I was laying there crying harder than I'd ever cried in my life, in the worst pain I'd ever been in my life, all of a sudden, this tremendous peace just started to cover me. And I started hearing the song Amazing Grace play over and over in my mind. And I thought that could only be music from heaven. I didn't know what it took to go there. I hoped that I would be good enough to go there. I hoped that heaven was a better place than this earth. I didn't really know what it was all about, but I just laid there hoping, waiting, and praying to die, resting in this peace that I felt. And all of a sudden, as I was laying there resting in this peace, I felt somebody pull my hair off my face and behind my ear. And I wasn't expecting anybody to find me. I didn't want anybody to find me. I had no idea who that was. But as I looked up, it was a firefighter who kind of stumbled back as I looked up at him. And he radioed to the other medical personnel my location and my status. They found me because it says in the police report that the conductor said to the engineer, "Did you see that yellow flash?" The engineer said to the conductor, "Yes, I think we just hit someone." The yellow flash that they'd seen was my bright yellow jacket I was wearing as I laid down on the tracks. So they called 911, and the firefighters and the paramedics were out looking for me for quite a while, but it took them a long time to find me because the train was blocking the road to the park, so they had to walk the tracks to find me, and this was the first gentleman to find me. And he radioed to the other people of my condition. They got there quickly. They decided they wanted to flight for life me to a hospital about an hour away, but they weren't in the end able to flight for life me because it was so foggy and cold out that night. So they did something that they've never done since, that wasn't protocol, that they'd never done beforehand. And this was that they blocked all of the roads and the intersections from where I was to the closest hospital in the area that could take me. It says in the police report that it's normally a 45-minute drive, but that they got me there in 8 minutes. And when I got to the hospital, I felt pretty normal. They asked me what my parents' names were, what my name was, what my sister's name was, what my parents' phone number was, what my sister's phone number was, and I was able to answer all of their questions. And very shortly afterwards, they started talking about how they felt like they were witnessing some sort of a miracle. And I was confused by that because I didn't feel like any sort of a miracle. I didn't really even want to be some sort of a miracle. But I found out later that I'd been run over by 33 freight train cars at 55 miles per hour. I should have been torn to pieces. And I lost 8 pints of blood. And scientifically, you're supposed to die after you lose 5. But I was still very much alive, conscious, talking, able to answer all of their questions. And I was still very depressed at the same time. I remember as they wheeled me down to the operating room, looking up at the doctor to my right in his bright white jacket and asking him if he thought I was going to live or die. I was hoping he'd give me some sort of assurance, but what he said to me was he didn't know. And he says that he told me that because he wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting to die, fighting to live. He just wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting. He knew that that would help me somehow, and I was in surgery that whole night. I had a number of blood transfusions. They tried to reattach my legs, which is something they weren't successful at doing. And I didn't wake up again until the next day at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was in intensive care. And I remember as I first opened my eyes, I saw my mom, my dad, my sister, my brother, and my brother-in-law all in the room with their arms crossed and their heads looking down at the floor. And my first thought was, wow, something really bad must have just happened. Because I didn't remember the events from the night before right away, but my mom's eyes met with mine first, and she ran to the side of my bed and she said, "Oh, honey, we're so glad you're okay." And I said, "Mom, they cut my clothes and they cut my coat." All the memories had started to flood back, and she said, "Honey, it's okay. We're just fine. Glad you're okay. We can get you new ones. We're just glad you're okay." I fell back asleep. I was on a lot of medication, and the next thing I remember was waking up because my doctor wanted to tell me what my injuries were. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I remember as he came into my room, I didn't say hi. I just stared out the window. He told me that my left leg was amputated well above the knee, my right leg was severed below the knee, but that I might be able to walk with the use of prosthetic legs someday. And I'm sure that he was just trying to give me some sort of encouragement and hope for the future. But I just really was not ready to deal with it yet. I didn't say hi, I didn't say bye, I didn't say thank you. I was really rude, and I just stared straight out the window the whole time. And I just tried to live in kind of my fantasy world. I wanted to go back. I didn't want to live in the present. And I fell back asleep after he left, and the next thing that happened is I woke up and I just felt gross and icky. I hadn't showered in days. I had blood, sweat, and tears on me. And I asked my mom if I could call my best friend Kelly to help me get cleaned up a little bit. Maybe she could do my hair, my makeup, make me feel a little bit better. And she said that would be fine. She dialed Kelly on the phone. And when Kelly got on the phone, she asked me how I was doing. I had no idea that she already knew what happened to me, but when she asked me how I was doing, I felt like I had to tell her something. She was my best friend. I'd known her since second grade. I just felt like I had to tell her something. So I looked down at my legs to see if they were actually gone, if they were still gone, if they had come back, if this was just a bad dream. And when I looked down, even with a sheet over my legs, I could tell that they looked much shorter than they had before, that they looked like they were still gone. And I assumed that they probably weren't coming back, that this probably was really happening, that this was probably going to be my new life. But I just didn't know how to tell her that. So I said, "I'm okay, but my legs are cut off." And as I said that, tears just streamed down my face, because that's the moment that it became real to me. That's when I realized this was my real life. This really, really was happening. And she said, "Oh, honey, it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. You don't need your legs. You're going to be just fine." And sometimes people think that's so simple, that's so trite. How could she have just said that? But it was really what I needed to hear. It was exactly what I needed to hear. I needed to know that my best friend thought I was going to be fine with or without my legs. She thought I was going to be just fine. And in the coming days, weeks, and months, all of my family and all of my friends surrounded me. And one of the things they told me over and over again was, "Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here. Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here." I heard it so much that I almost got sick of it, because I didn't know why I was here or what I was supposed to do here. But the very first weekend that we got out of the hospital, just for the weekend, on Sunday, we went back to church, just like we always did. And while we were there, a woman came up to me who had heard about what happened to me that I didn't know, and she told me that I would have went to hell if I died. And I really struggled with that, because everybody else around me told me what I call the feel-good answer. They would always say, "Oh, Kristen, of course you would have went to heaven. Don't worry about it." But I knew that it was by God's grace already. I knew that it was by His grace that I survived. Everybody said that it was a miracle that I survived, that I far surpassed the odds, that I shouldn't have been here anymore. So I wanted to know, if I wasn't here anymore, where I would have been. If I would have died, would I have been in heaven or hell? I just wanted to know, one way or another, where would I have been for real? And so I don't recommend telling people just straight out like that you would go to hell. But it was something that God still used. It sent me searching. It made me really, really question things. And I started to pray about it because I really wanted to know the truth. And very shortly afterwards, a couple came to have dinner with our family. And this couple were friends with my sister, and I found out while they were at dinner with us that the husband of this couple was in seminary to be a pastor. So I figured that he probably knew the Bible more than anybody else that I knew, and I asked him if he thought I would have went to heaven or hell if I died. And very lovingly, very sensitively, he told me that every single one of us are created to be in this very real and personal relationship with God. But because of our sin and because of the wrong things that we have done, we are separated from him, both eternally and relationally. And that's why Jesus died. That's why Jesus died, to pay the penalty for our sin, so that we can be put back into a right relationship with God and so that we can spend eternity in heaven with him. But we have to choose to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of our sins, and we have to choose to let him lead our lives. And when he told me this, I knew that what he was telling me was something more true than anything I'd ever heard in my life before, but I didn't want to just take his word for it. So I asked him to show me it in the Bible. And he showed me a lot of different verses, but the verse that stood out to me the most was John 14:6. And that's where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And I felt like after reading that, like Jesus could not have been more clear. He said he was the way, the truth, and the life. The way to God, the way to Father, the way to life. And I knew that I had never made any sort of a decision to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of my sins. I knew that I wasn't letting him lead my life. I knew that something really important and special seemed to be missing from my life, so I suspected that was this real relationship with God that I was just learning about. And I knew after trying to take my own life that I had a lot of sin to be forgiven for. So sitting on the floor in my parents' dining room, I just prayed the most simple little prayer. I asked God to forgive me for everything I had done wrong, even the sin of trying to take my own life. I realized that night that my life wasn't mine to take, that God alone can give and take life. And I asked him to forgive me for all of that, and I asked him to give me a new life and to help me follow him. And I know that as I went to sleep that night, I just felt a little bit different. I know that was the night that I became a Christian. I felt like a weight had just been lifted off of my shoulders. And like I didn't need to worry so much about my life anymore. I would have told you my whole life that I was a Christian, but I had never made that choice before. I never came to a place of surrender, and I had never had a relationship with God until that day. And sometimes I wish I could tell people that it all changed overnight, but it was a process. Like most of us, I was on a long journey. And for the next 3 years, I still struggled with suicidal thoughts and depression. I was in and out of psych wards. I was in and out of jobs. I was in and out of school. I was on and off of different medications. It was a really, really, really hard time, but God was still very much present and involved. He was going to do anything to get a hold of my heart. And I was really, really blessed by one particular woman who was my counselor. I wasn't seeking a Christian counselor, but I ended up having a Christian counselor. And she spoke more truth into my life than anybody at the time. And one of the things she helped me realize was that I was a whole person, with or without my legs. As long as I had Christ, I had everything I needed, and I wasn't missing anything. And the other thing she helped me realize was that I was a whole person. Sorry, I just said that. I was a whole person, with or without my legs, and that I needed to forgive myself. I had accepted God's forgiveness at this point, but I hadn't forgiven myself for how this decision had forever changed my life. And I realized in many ways I was still punishing myself for what I had done. And she had me memorize Romans 8:1, which is where it says, "Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." And I remember I would just say that to myself over and over again. It's the very first verse I ever memorized. Therefore, there's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And the more that I just let those words soak into my heart and into my mind, I realized that if God could forgive me, there was no reason for me not to forgive myself. And by not forgiving myself, I was just holding myself back from all of the things that he wanted for me. And so I started to forgive myself. And the more that I did that, the more freedom I started to find. And about the same time, I started going to a church that my counselor recommended. And this woman I met in the community college I was going to told me her story one night. And she just told me her story in the parking lot out of nowhere. And I remember just listening to her, watching her, seeing her shine with more peace and more joy and more love for life than anybody I'd ever met before. And I felt like thank you. I felt like when I went home that night, I said to God, I want to know you the way that lady knows you. I just felt like I didn't know him the way that she did. And that was something that I really needed. I wanted to have the fullness of a relationship with God like she did. She shined with more peace and more joy and more love for life than anybody I'd ever met before. And so what I felt him tell me as I said, God, I want to know you the way that lady knows you. So I felt him say, Kristen, you need to let me be your best friend. And at that time in my life, I was learning to go to other people for help with my problems. I was going to my doctors, my counselors, my parents, my friends, but I really wasn't going to God for help with my problems. And I realized that he was the one who made me. He was the one who knew me and my problems better than anybody else in this world. He also knew the answers better than anyone else in this world. So why wouldn't I go to him for help with my problems? Why wouldn't I ask him for help with my problems? Why wouldn't I talk to him for everything? Why wouldn't I let him be my very best friend? And so I started letting him be my best friend. It was sort of an experiment. But as I walked towards him and I started talking to him just like I would my best friend, the more I walked towards him, the more I felt like I was walking straight out of my depression. I was able to get off of all of my antidepressants and all of my pain meds that my doctors told me I would have to take for the rest of my life. I started to experience the peace and the joy and the love for life that I never had before, but I always wanted. I was able to quit smoking. I was able to quit drinking. And my life was just turning around in more ways than I can ever describe. Very shortly after all of that happened, I decided I wanted to get baptized in the church that I had found. And at my baptism, my parents came, and my mom became a Christian. And she started bringing my dad to church with him, and he became a Christian. My dad started bringing my brother to church with him, and he became a Christian. And it was a very, very special time for our family because we would have always told you that we were Christians. We would always have told you that we believed in God. But we had no relationship with God. He was kind of up here in our lives. We went to church on Sundays, and that was about it. Maybe we prayed at meals, but that was as far as our relationship with God went. We never made that decision to accept Jesus into our heart for the forgiveness of our sins or to let him lead our lives. And we didn't have a relationship with him. But now that we all did, we started talking about things that we never talked about before. We started praying together in ways that we never would have before. We started listening to a lot of the same music, reading a lot of the same books. So it was a very, very special time for our family. God was redeeming so much more than I can explain. And very shortly after all of that happened, I got asked to share my story in the high school youth group at our church. I had been volunteering as a leader there, but I was never expecting to share my story. And I wasn't really interested in sharing my story. I really was scared to do that. When I shared it at my baptism, I thought it would be the last time I ever shared it, the first and the last. But when I got asked to share it at the youth group, I realized that I didn't want anyone else ever to have to go through what I did and wait for something terrible to happen in their lives before they realized how big and how real and how faithful God is. So I just decided I would share my story in front of all the high schoolers, and hopefully they could learn from my mistake instead of making the same sort of mistakes themselves. And I shared my story as openly and as vulnerably as I could, and when I was done, almost every single one of the students came up to me and told me that they struggled with suicidal thoughts or depression, or they knew somebody who did. And that's when I realized that suicidal thoughts and depression were a much bigger issue than I realized before, and that I was much less alone than I realized before, that it was much more common. And I started to develop a burden in my heart to help people like that because they were just like me. And after I shared my story at that youth group, I started getting asked to share my story other places. And I kept thinking that God would open one door and I'd walk through it and it would be the last time I'd share my story. But every time he opened one door and I walked through it and I shared the story, another door would open and another door would open and another door would open. And it was incredible because I never expected God to use my story to help other people. I, in some ways, understood that he would do what he did in my life to help me, but I never expected that it could help other people. But as I was sharing my story, it was almost like I was seeing people's lives changed before my eyes. I was seeing people choose life over death. I was seeing people choose Jesus over suicide. I was seeing like the chains and the blinders come off of people as I shared my story, and it was humbling, it was an honor, it was amazing, it was crazy, it was just awesome. And I started praying about what God wanted me to do with my life. I knew that he kept me here for a reason, and what I realized was that the biggest reason he kept me here for was so that I could know him personally and intimately. But the second biggest reason he kept me here was so that I could help other people come to know him in an intimate and personal way. And after I felt him tell me that, and I knew that it was for sure true, I decided I would go to college at Moody Bible Institute. And if you knew me in high school, you would be very surprised by that because that's not something I would have ever done at that time in my life. But going to Bible college was a very, very important and special step for me because I had so many godly men and women just pouring into my life. And while I was there, I got asked to share my story on the Oprah show. And again, it wasn't something I was pursuing, expecting, wanting to do, but I felt like it was a door that God was opening that I could walk through and that I should walk through. And so after I taped the show with them, it aired about a week later, and once it aired on TV, thousands of emails came in through the ministry website that I had started. And one of the emails in particular stood out to me because it was in capital letters. The subject line in black and white print said, "You saved my life." And people had said things like that to me before, but never in those words, never so clearly, never in black and white capital letters had I seen it in print before. So I was pretty amazed. And as I read his email, this young man told me that he was planning to take his own life the day that my story aired on the Oprah show. He was just waiting for his mom to leave for work. And when she left for work, he walked into the living room with a gun in his hand. And as he went to turn the TV off, I was on the TV talking about how I had tried to take my life and how Jesus had forever changed my life and given me so much hope and joy for the future. He said that he got down on his knees, he prayed to accept Jesus as his Lord and Savior, and his life has changed so much that now he is now a youth pastor leading other people to the Lord. But before I even knew that was going to happen, I was amazed by God. I was amazed by how God is in the details, by how he was putting me on the TV, sharing my story that day, exactly when that young man needed to know that he had hope in Christ, just like I did. He could have so much more hope and so much bigger of a life than he expected. He was in the details when I laid on the train tracks and got run over by 33 freight train cars at 55 miles per hour. He was in the details when I lost 8 pints of blood and I was supposed to die after I lost 5. He was in the details when he brought this man who was in seminary to my house to help me understand what the Bible said about heaven and about hell and about a relationship with God and about what Jesus did for us. He was in the details when he put this woman in the parking lot at the community college I was going to, who really truly knew him and could help me understand what it meant to be in a thriving relationship with him. He is in the details in all of our lives. And sometimes it's hard to see it, but he is working all things together for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. And he has so many good things planned for every one of us. God doesn't just have a plan for special people. He has a plan for every single one of us. And in those darkest, deepest, hardest, most difficult times of my life, I remember just holding on to this verse that I got on a magnet in a card while I was in the hospital. I kept it on my refrigerator, and it said, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, but to give you a hope and a future." That verse is found in Jeremiah 29:11. And I remember that I would just hold on to that verse. I would believe that even when I didn't have a hope for myself, God had a hope for me. Even when I didn't have a future for myself, God had a future for me. And even when I didn't have plans for myself, God had plans for me. And he has that for every single one of us. He doesn't just have plans for special people. He has plans for you and me just the same. He has special things and amazing things that he wants to do through each and every one of us. We all have a special and unique calling. So I encourage you, if you have never made a decision to accept Jesus into your heart or into your life, to make that decision today, to let him lead your life. Let him forgive you for everything you've ever done wrong. Let him give you a new life. And if you've already made that decision, I encourage you to go deeper with God than you have ever gone before. I have been able to do a lot of amazing things. After my story aired on the Oprah show, I started writing it in a book with an amazing Christian woman. It took us about 2 years to write the book, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it's probably one of the best things I've ever done, because God is using that more ways than I think he's even using me when I share my story like this, because the book is now in 8 languages. It was given the title Life in Spite of Me. And I can't even take credit for that. My publisher came up with it, but I can't think of a more fitting title, because God has unbelievably given me life physically, spiritually, and emotionally, all in spite of my sin, in spite of my mistakes, in spite of my shortcomings, in spite of my weaknesses. He has given me so much more than I could have ever dreamed. And I've gotten to do so many things in my service with him, between writing a book and traveling and speaking and doing TV and radio interviews, but none of it, not even being married now or having a baby now, compares to knowing him. Nothing compares in this universe to having a relationship with him. But he continues to be so faithful to me. Life still has struggles. I'm not happy all of the time. But he continues to show me what his plan is for me, and the closer I am with him, the more I have that peace and that joy and that love for life that I have always wanted. It's been amazing in the most recent years to see his plans for me unfold. Like I said, I got married 3 years ago. I had a baby 2 years ago, and we named our son Grayson. And we named him Grayson in honor of the grace that God had on my life that day that I tried to take it. Grace is when God has favor on us and we don't even deserve it. I know that he had favor on me when I didn't deserve it. I didn't deserve a second chance at my life, but he gave it to me anyway. And I am so incredibly honored and humbled to still be here today, to be able to be here talking to each one of you today, to be able to smile, to be able to laugh, to be able to enjoy my family, to enjoy my children, to enjoy the weather outside. It's surreal sometimes to realize that this is my life, because God has brought me so far. I feel like I'm such a different person now, and my family has changed in so many of the same ways. It's amazing. So please just seek him with everything in you. Know that suicide is never the answer. It will always take more from you than it could ever bring you. Jesus is certainly the answer. Like the Bible says, he is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father but through him. So seek Jesus with everything in you, and know that this isn't a sad story. I would not trade everything I've learned or my relationship with God ever to have my legs back. Thank you so very much for listening.
Just to say, God, I'm adding you into my equation. I'm adding you into this problem. And when God had a purpose for his pit, to just like he has a purpose for your pit that you're into, he's not going to let you down. When you believe the Bible and the Bible alone, I said, that's what we... Suddenly one day you're going to wake up and you're going to be like, I don't really have animosity towards that person anymore. But I promise you that I think today you'll be really, really encouraged at the very end, because I learned something I never even thought of.